A woman had just paid for a cup of coffee for a billionaire, which caught his attention. He approached her to say thank you and exchange contact information. Just then, the woman's phone rang. He quietly observed her and learned from her conversation that she was a bar singer. The man gazed at her retreating figure with affection and smiled. That night, the man visited the bar where the woman performed. Her stage presence captivated him. The woman also noticed the man, and their eyes met. After she left the stage, he closed his eyes, savoring the memory of her voice. Meanwhile, the woman was reflecting on the feeling of their gaze. As she was about to leave work, a persistent customer tried to lure her into becoming his mistress with money. She slapped him and walked away. The man, seeing this, chased after her, intending to force her to leave with him. At that moment, the billionaire intervened. He angrily pushed the man into his car and warned him to leave. As the car drove away, it accidentally crushed the woman's violin. The billionaire picked up the broken instrument and offered to compensate her. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and got into a taxi. Back at home, the woman wept over the broken violin, a gift from her late father. She cried herself to sleep that night. The next day, when she arrived at the coffee shop, she ran into the man again. He apologized to her, explaining that the man from the night before was his client and that he would cover all the damages. The woman accepted his apology, but asked him to buy her a cup of coffee. They smiled at each other and introduced themselves. The man's name was Anthony, and the woman's name was Susan. Anthony suddenly told Susan that he hoped she would like it, and then coolly walked away. When she followed him outside, she saw a street musician singing her name. In front of them was a brand new violin with Susan engraved on it. The romantic gesture touched her deeply, and her affection for Anthony soared to 100%. However, when Susan got home and looked up information about Anthony, she discovered that he was the CEO of a major corporation. But it seemed that the billionaire had been involved with over 10,000 people. Susan felt angry, and her affection for Anthony plummeted to 10%. That evening, as Susan was preparing to leave work and head home, Anthony was already waiting for her at the entrance. She approached him with a smile. Anthony suggested giving her a ride home, to which Susan politely nodded in agreement. She walked over to the car, placed her violin back inside, and closed the door. She then told Anthony, "If you're looking for someone to pass the time with, you've got the wrong person." With that, she turned and left. Anthony watched her go with a smile, finding Susan's personality truly unique and unforgettable. One day, Anthony's mother urgently called him back home to meet a potential girlfriend she had in mind. However, Anthony's thoughts were entirely preoccupied with Susan, and he had no interest in the woman his mother wanted to introduce. He made an excuse about having work to handle and left. On the other side, Susan received a call from her close friend, who informed her that a hotel themed around Snow's Capes was in need of a resident singer. Her friend, being unavailable, recommended Susan for the job. Susan initially wanted to decline, but upon hearing that they were offering $3,000 per night, she immediately accepted. She packed her bags and set off. Unfortunately, her car broke down halfway there. Just then, the man appeared. Susan looked at him in surprise and asked why he was there. Anthony claimed he was just passing by and offered Susan a ride in his car. What Susan didn't know was that this whole encounter had been orchestrated by Anthony and her friend. When the two arrived at the hotel, the front desk informed Susan that there was no record of a reservation or any invitation for a singer to perform. As Susan anxiously tried to explain the situation, Anthony revealed the truth to her. Frustrated, Susan stormed out with her luggage, but after walking for several kilometers without spotting a taxi, she had no choice but to return to the hotel. Anthony approached her and mentioned that there was a banquet that evening, hoping she would give him a chance. Susan knew that chips couldn't satisfy her hunger, so she agreed to go to the restaurant. Every step she took tugged at Anthony's heart. They talked about work and family, and with the slight buzz from the alcohol, Susan opened up. They wandered around like a couple in the throes of passion, hugging each other for warmth in the snow, their hearts gradually drawing closer. When they returned to the hotel, the short corridor seemed like an endless mountain range, and they both slowed their pace. Just as they were about to open the door, they both turned to look at each other and then kissed passionately. Back in her room, Susan was still intoxicated by the sudden happiness. However, the brief reunion was inevitably followed by parting. That night, Anthony drove Susan back. Just as the two were about to share a farewell kiss, a man's voice shattered the moment. This man was Susan's obsessive suitor. Anthony stepped forward, telling the man to stop bothering Susan, and pushed him away. Suddenly, the man pulled out a knife and lunged forward. Seeing Anthony fall to the ground, the man fled in panic. While waiting at the hospital, Susan was confronted by Anthony's younger brother, William, who accused her of being too different from his brother and asked her to leave quietly to avoid further trouble. Perhaps it was a mistake from the start. After returning home, Susan was heartbroken. Meanwhile, Anthony was being taken care of by the woman his mother had chosen for him. Susan numbed herself with work and lacked the courage to answer Anthony's calls. But the more she tried to escape, the more the reality confronted her in different ways. One day, while on her way to work, Susan spotted a magazine featuring Anthony on the street. Although it was just a photo, she held it close to her heart. Anthony also showed up at her workplace. The moment Susan saw him, her eyes lit up. Anthony gazed at her affectionately. Maybe this is love, a force that breaks through barriers to meet. Susan told Anthony, "There are too many differences between us." Anthony gently caressed Susan's cheek and said, "For you, I am willing to do anything." Susan replied firmly, "So am I." Anthony looked deeply into the eyes of the woman he loved and asked, "Will you marry me?" Then Anthony took Susan back to his home. However, Anthony's mother seemed hostile towards Susan's arrival. She clearly told Anthony that she wanted him to marry the woman she had arranged for him, the one in the red dress, Miss Annie. Susan looked at Annie in surprise. While Anthony was arguing with his mother, Susan left sorrowfully. She wandered along the unfamiliar streets. Anthony hurried after her, but couldn't see her, so he drove around searching. Finally, he found her on a bus halfway. The next morning, the two went to register their marriage. Afterwards, Anthony took Susan to choose a wedding ring. A ring displayed in the showcase caught her eye. However, the shop owner told them that the ring was not for sale. It was only given to someone with a destined connection. It had a heart-wrenching love story behind it. And so, he began to recount the past of the ring's owner and his love. Susan listened, utterly fascinated, and she too hoped that her love would be just as beautiful. The shop owner decided to give the ring to them, hoping they could create a new love story with it. Susan then took Anthony to the place where she was born, a place filled with happy memories for her. Anthony looked at Susan and promised her a grand wedding. But Susan said what she truly wanted was simple, just a home. Ever since her parents had passed away, she had been alone. Anthony took her hand and said, "From now on, I'll be with you." Susan touched his chest and said, "From now on, this is my home." The next day, Anthony brought Susan to live in his home. As Susan was getting used to the new place, Anthony's mother pushed open the door and told Susan, "I will not acknowledge you as Anthony's wife." Susan replied, "I don't mind what you say now, because one day you will accept me and even like me, because I am your son's wife." When it was time for dinner, Anthony's mother flatly refused to join. At this moment, the butler came over to convey Anthony's mother's words, "I will not dine with a stranger." After hearing this, Susan went to the kitchen and carefully prepared a dinner. However, the meal she spent 60 minutes cooking was knocked to the ground by Anthony's mother in just 1 second. Despite her frustration, Susan pretended as if nothing had happened and returned to the dining table. Although Susan's act was convincing, Anthony, who had been paying close attention to her, noticed her unhappiness. After returning to the room, he gently caressed Susan's face and comforted her, saying, "You've already taken the most difficult step. The rest is just a matter of time." Meanwhile, Annie also learned about Anthony's marriage. She tore apart the wedding dress that Anthony's mother had given her. Upon hearing this, Anthony's mother took out her own dowry from the bottom of the chest. She found Annie and told her that her initial intentions had never changed. She then held up the diamond-encrusted gown and invited Annie to a banquet at her home that evening. That night, in front of everyone, Anthony's mother announced that she would hold a grand double wedding and that Anthony's younger brother, William, would marry Annie. Although Annie had wanted to marry Anthony, her goal had always been to become a wealthy and privileged lady. After the meal, Anthony's mother said to the two future daughters-in-law, "Whoever gives birth to a son first will be the heir to this house." The next morning, Susan arrived in the kitchen early to make breakfast. However, her efforts still failed to win over Anthony's mother, who remained averse to the food Susan prepared. Not only that, but she also showed favoritism. One day, she deliberately took Susan and Annie to a wedding dress store. She let Annie choose whatever she wanted, but had Susan just stand by and watch. When Annie emerged in a white gown, Susan felt utterly helpless. She went outside, where the oppressive feeling almost made it impossible for her to breathe. Because Susan was not the person Anthony's mother had in mind, she was constantly subjected to intentional difficulties. Anthony was aware of Susan's situation. In order to make Susan happy, he took her to a bar to relax. Suddenly, Susan was pulled onto the stage by her close friend. Her singing won applause from everyone present. When she came down, a man stopped her. Seeing the strange man holding Susan's hand, Anthony walked over angrily and directly took Susan away from the bar. On the way back, the two kept arguing about the incident. That night, they slept in separate rooms. Without each other's company, neither of them could fall asleep for a long time. They both opened their doors at the same time and embraced to make up. Finally, the day of the wedding arrived. The hall was filled with guests. They walked in with their brides, receiving blessings from friends and family. While everyone was immersed in this happy moment, danger was slowly approaching them.